called nNOS and eNOS. Why are those turned on? Well, they're both calcium-dependent enzymes. They basically don't work unless there's calcium there, and the more calcium there is, the faster they generate nitric oxide. And so here's another little cycle in here. There are a number of mechanisms by which peroxynitrite and even nitric oxide can increase the levels of superoxide, this other compound that we talked about. You know, these are all discussed at great length in my book. And then there are a number of other things. These are a couple of receptors, vanilloid receptor, NMDA receptors. These are important mainly in the nervous system. Okay, so if you turn these on, they're going to have effects on the nervous system, and they also act to increase nitric oxide and peroxynitrite. Okay, so there's some things that interact with the nervous system. There's some inflammatory cytokines here, and there's basic biochemistry that's sort of in the middle of everything. Okay, now so basically, let me just say. This part of the cycle is classic inflammatory biochemistry. It's what's involved in inflammation, and you've already heard today that inflammation seems to be very closely related to CFS-ME, and so I would argue this is where this inflammatory biochemistry is coming from. Okay. Let me just say, you know, the biochemistry is complex, and there are at least two things that are not obvious from the figure that I just showed you that I think are important here. And one is that peroxynitrite and to a lesser extent superoxide and nitric oxide impact energy metabolism. They impact the ability of cells to produce metabolic energy in the form of ATP. They are known to attack a number of components in the mitochondria, and this is the part of the cell that generates energy in the form of ATP. And that's important both because it's involved in some of those arrows that we talked about before, and also because it's important in terms of generating symptoms and signs of illness. And I think both of those are important in terms of understanding what's going on here. Okay, so there's a second mechanism which I think is important, and that is that, again, I apologize for the complexity here. Peroxynitrite oxidizes a compound known as tetrahydrobiopterin, which is a cofactor for the nitric oxide synthase. So all three of those nitric oxide synthases that we talked about before require tetrahydrobiopterin in order to make nitric oxide. When peroxynitrite oxidizes this compound, it produces what's called an uncoupling of these nitric oxide synthases. And so the ones that don't have tetrahydrobiopterin start producing superoxide in place of nitric oxide. So these two compounds, of course, what do? Well, one of the things they do is they react with each other to form peroxynitrite. So if you have partial uncoupling, what you're going to have is a whole bunch of nitric oxide synthases concentrated in those cells and those regions of cells that have the most nitric oxide synthases. And they're going to be churning out a large amount of peroxynitrite, and that's going to keep this cycle going. Okay? So even though partial uncoupling lowers nitric oxide, it probably has a very important role in maintaining this pathophysiology. Okay. So this is basically a vicious cycle sort of within the larger vicious cycle. And it may have a key role in initiating these illnesses and in getting them started, this partial uncoupling. There are 5 principles that underlie this whole mechanism. And we've already talked about 2 of them. Short-term stressors can initiate these basically either by increasing nitric oxide or other cycle elements. Okay, and this increases in nitric oxide and peroxynitrite initiate this cycle, and one of the predictions of that is that each of the cycle elements will be elevated in the chronic phase of illness, and of course that's testable And in fact, we've got quite a bit of data on that. One of the other predictions is that the symptoms and signs of illness should be caused by elevated elements of the cycle, and those include nitric oxide, superoxide, etc., the cytokines, which I didn't put in here, and so forth. So, and so there's actually quite a bit of evidence on that, and I'll talk about some of that very briefly. The fourth principle is a very important one, and that is the basic biochemistry of this cycle is local. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that in each individual, it may impact and be located in certain tissues and not in other tissues. Okay, so it may be located in certain parts of the body, but not other parts of the body. And the reason for this local nature is because nitric oxide, superoxide, and peroxynitrite have relatively short half-lives in biological tissues. They don't last very long from the time they're made to the time they're destroyed, typically. And these arrows, these positive feedback loops that I discussed in there, act at the level of individual cells. Okay? So what that means is that this cycle can be turned on in one tissue, and you may have an adjacent tissue in the body that may be largely unimpacted. And the consequence of that is that you can have all kinds of variations from one individual to another, to a third, to a fourth, and so forth. And so one of the great puzzles about this whole group of illnesses is, why are they so variable? And the answer, I think, is very clear. And I would argue, and I think that some of the data that, for instance, that Jonathan Kerr presented today, that these variations that you see may be largely due to which tissues are impacted in which individuals. Okay, and so I think that's that's the likely interpretation, but obviously some people may differ on that. The fifth principle is that therapy should focus on downregulating parts of the no-no cycle rather than on symptomatic relief. And let me just say, I think we have some very promising ways of doing exactly that. I'd say one other thing. I mean, what this, the implication of this is we should be treating the cause, not the symptoms. There are three types of kind of generic evidence for the reality of the no-no cycle, or something very similar to it. These three are discussed in my book. I don't really have time to talk about them here, but they exist, and you might look at the book and see, read about them. Each of the following have been reported in 2 or 3 or 4 of the multi-system illnesses that I talked about earlier. Okay. And of these, so these are all different aspects of the no-no cycle that we've just discussed. And of these, the only one that has not been shown to occur in ME/CFS is the vanilloid receptor elevation. That has been studied in fibromyalgia, and it's also been studied in multiple chemical sensitivity. It's never been studied in ME/CFS. So we have no data on that, but all the others we have data on, and all the others seem to be elevated. Okay, so that's actually quite a bit of evidence kind of supporting this model for ME/CFS. One of the things that I talk about in my book are, how the different symptoms and signs can be generated. And so one of the predictions, of course, of the model is that these should all be generated from elements of the cycle. And so there's a description, and in fact, this corresponds to some of the things that have been discussed earlier, where, particular changes that one sees in this, and let me just say, these are all non-specific symptoms and signs. These occur in all 4 of the multi-system illnesses that I introduced earlier. Okay, they're not specific for CFS-ME, But you know, we have fatigue, we have changes in the immune system, both up and down regulation, and we have learning and memory dysfunction, we have orthostatic intolerance, we have pain, we have depression. So a wide variety of different symptoms and signs can be explained as being a consequence of elements of the cycle. You know, obviously impacting different systems in the body. I mean, the immune system, the circulatory system, the central nervous system in the case of pain, depression. Some, you know, classic psychiatric symptoms, I think you can argue, is a function of the impact on the central nervous system. And anxiety, sleep dysfunction that Dr. Hyde talked about, and then we have oxidative stress, which is probably the most widely studied change in CFS-ME.